Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture, which is going to kick off Unit 2 with Section 2.2, Martin Luther and the Beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Our objective for today's lecture is to explain how and why religious beliefs and practices changed from 1450 to 1648, and the theme of today's lecture is cultural and intellectual developments. Before we start learning about Martin Luther and how he began the Protestant Reformation, we need to take a couple minutes to examine and learn about the roots of the Reformation that began as early as the Middle Ages. Now, you might remember that one of the precedents established in the Middle Ages is that the church had more power than kings. This was established way back with Charlemagne being crowned Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800, and also how the church was the one who anointed kings in various states. Now, as we get to the later Middle Ages, we will see that some of these secular rulers are going to challenge that precedent that the church is above the state. So we start to see these challenges from secular rulers, particularly the rulers of these new nation states, those new monarchs that we have learned about. They began to assume more control over the church as part of the expansion of their own royal authority and sovereignty. As a result, the Catholic Church in various countries began to take on a bit of a national character. So we would see more of a Spanish Catholic Church or a French Catholic Church. This was also supported by the fact that the government was able to appoint high-ranking clergy and even claim church land for taxation. And also in Central Europe, the complexity of the political arrangements of the German states, which were part of the Holy Roman Empire, and also the political arrangement of Italy, a series of city-states, really limited the direct authority of the Pope in those regions as well. Now, another issue facing the church are the numerous clerical abuses that were evident in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. So, these clerical abuses became common almost at every level of the church hierarchy. They include immorality. This were things like even monks being drunk frequently, priests and bishops, and even popes with lovers, mistresses, illegitimate children. Also, ignorance. It was very common for priests and lower clergy to have a very poor education and be borderline illiterate, in fact. Pluralism was the practice of when one clergy member held more than one office. For example, someone who was the bishop of, let's say, Milan might also be the bishop of Turin, and a bishop of another place, and a bishop of another place. Um, and so obviously it would be difficult for that bishop to be in all places at once. And so this resulted in absenteeism when they held more than one position. Now, pluralism was also caused by simony. Simony was the selling of church offices. Many archbishops and bishops were Italian, but did not visit their diocese, usually because they might be able to control a couple dioceses. Simony was the selling of church offices, especially at the higher level, and this was actually very, very common. Indulgences were another example of the corruption within the church. This was specifically connected to the financial abuses of the church. And indulgences were those get out of purgatory free tickets. Well, not really free, you had to pay for them, but it was like a fast pass out of purgatory that you could purchase from the church. And then finally, nepotism. Nepotism is the appointment of friends and family to positions they are not qualified for. This was also very common, especially in the higher levels of the church. We would see this frequently with the popes and their nephews or even children might be appointed into the College of Cardinals. Also, scandals like the Great Western Schism and much of the Renaissance papacy also discredited the church and damaged its reputation. So these numerous abuses led to a sentiment of anti-clericalism. Anti-clericalism meaning that people did not really support or trust the clergy of the church. I mean, they were still Christian, they were still devout and faithful, but they did not trust the clergy. And this also led to increasing criticism of the clergy because of these clerical abuses from various groups in society. Many common people viewed the church as part of the oppressive ruling class, whereas the urban middle class viewed the church as part of the feudalistic hierarchy of the Middle Ages. And these urbanites, the bourgeoisie, wanted to control their own beliefs much like they began to control their own business. And then finally, nobles and monarchs often engaged in a bit of a power struggle with the church because these nobles and especially the monarchs wanted to control their own territory independent from the influence of the church. Now, even before Martin Luther will post his 95 Theses in 1517, there are numerous calls for reform in the decades and even centuries leading up to the Reformation. One example we've already learned about are late medieval reformers, John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. These late medieval reformers spoke out publicly against the corruption within the Catholic Church and were very critical of its practices. Unfortunately, Jan Hus was burned at the stake in the Holy Roman Empire because, of course, any criticism of the church was considered blasphemy and heresy was a crime punishable by death. So this is why we do not see more people speaking publicly against the church. However, Jan Hus had developed a following, and those followers were known as Hussites, and this really established a ripe foundation for Martin Luther's ideas and eventual success in the 16th century. Also, during the Great Western Schism, there had been a movement to develop a church council. This was called the conciliar movement, and there was even the brief manifestation of a church council, which was known as the Council at Constance. And again, the goal of this movement and this brief council was to resolve the Great Western Schism, which was a pretty big scandal in the church. In general, the conciliar movement, which continued after the Great Western Schism to an extent, called for a council to rule the church alongside the Pope. So instead of having the Pope having all the supreme power, there would be a council, kind of like a Congress, ruling the church alongside the Pope. However, the popes of the Renaissance, that followed the Great Western Schism, worked on consolidating their power, much like other new monarchs. And so later in the 15th century, the conciliar movement was declared a form of heresy by Pope Pius II. And so that ended that particular movement for reform. There was also a movement known as modern devotion that emerged in the late Middle Ages. Modern devotion was a reform movement that was found in the Low Countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, and also in parts of Germany in the 14th and 15th centuries. This movement called for the rediscovery of pious practices such as humility, obedience, and the simplicity of life. People who followed the modern devotion movement were still Christian, they were still Catholic, they were incredibly devout, but they tended to follow a more simple, basic, foundational form of practice. We can sort of think of them as a what would Jesus do type of movement. Also, mysticism was not as common, but we do see a couple examples of mysticism, especially within monks and nuns. So mysticism is considered to be the direct and transformative presence of God. Oftentimes someone who is extremely devout and has gone through serious sacrifice might experience this euphoric transcendental experience as they have this direct connection with God. And the reason this is kind of even controversial is because if a average person could have that direct connection with God, it sort of circumvents the need for the church to be the conduit between the people and God. So, for example, we could sort of think of Joan of Arc potentially as a 15th century mystic. Also, in the High to Late Middle Ages, we see new religious orders such as Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians emerge. These are new forms of monasticism. Specifically, they're going to take on a new style, which we call mendicant monasticism. So these were certain Christian religious orders that adopted a lifestyle of poverty, traveling, and often living in urban areas for the purpose of preaching, evangelizing, and ministry, especially to the poor. And so members of these religious orders tended to embrace a poor, itinerant lifestyle. The reason this is notable is because these mendicant orders rejected the previously established monastic model that defined most of the Middle Ages, where monks would be cloistered in isolated communities out in rural areas, almost completely shut off by society. These orders began to emerge in the 13th century and were founded by some of the famous saints of the Catholic Church, like Saint Francis of Assisi from Italy is the founder of the Franciscan order, and Saint Dominic Guzman of Spain was the founder of the Dominican order. And finally, Northern humanism and the Northern Renaissance played a strong role in influencing the Protestant Reformation. Scholars like Desiderius Erasmus were very critical of church practices, the widespread corruption, and also many superstitions that were considered part of church practice. And so we can say that the Reformation was in some ways the work of humanists moving beyond the constraint of church theology. So it's important to recognize that there is a direct connection between the humanism of the Renaissance and the ideas that emerged in the Protestant Reformation. And that will become evident later in the lecture. So let's start by getting to know this guy, Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was an Augustinian friar, so he was part of those new mendicant religious orders, and he would eventually become a professor of scripture, meaning a professor of biblical study, in Wittenberg, a town in what is basically today central Germany. Martin Luther was born in Saxony, which is part of Germany, and at the time it was right smack dab in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Martin Luther had a strict, overbearing father who wanted him to become a lawyer, and initially Martin Luther went to school to study law. But one of the times when Martin Luther was traveling either back home or back to school, he was caught in a thunderstorm, this huge thunderstorm in the forest as he was riding his donkey. And the thunderstorm was so frightening and violent that Martin Luther prayed to Saint Anne, a patron saint of travelers, I believe, to save him. And if he was saved, and if he survived the storm, he vowed to become a monk. And lo and behold, he survived the storm, and so he devoted himself to religious life, joining the Augustinian order. He spent many, many years, of course, as an Augustinian monk, and later became a professor of scripture at the University of Wittenberg. Now, one of the issues that Martin Luther had was extreme anxiety over the concept of salvation, because the Catholic Church placed so much emphasis on salvation and had a very mechanical, almost manipulative path towards salvation, saying that you had to do this and you had to do that and you had to do this and you had to do that. And so, in an attempt to make sure he achieved salvation, Martin Luther practiced strict monasticism, believing that he was never going to be good enough. So this included things like extreme fasting, meaning not eating at all, praying for hours and hours on end, confession, 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 and even self mutilation with flagellation. He was consumed by the doubt of his own personal unworthiness and was just never convinced that he would do enough to justify being saved in the eyes of the Catholic Church. One way he did find comfort, however, was in careful study of the Bible. He was, of course, a professor of biblical scripture. And one day he not just came across this passage, but he read this passage that really spoke to him and ultimately initiated his whole reform movement. And this is from the book of Romans 1:17, the just shall live by faith. The just shall live by faith. And so that leads to the key component of Martin Luther's ideas and also the key component of Protestantism, which is this idea of salvation through faith alone, solo fide. Salvation through faith alone. Now, this was very similar to the idea of some of the Christian humanists. As we've said before, Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, right? And so Luther believed that the only thing that someone needed in order to be saved was faith that was their own personal faith in the religion, right? They didn't have to go to confession. They didn't have to, pay the tithe. They didn't have to worship saints. They didn't have to buy indulgences, all these things that the Catholic Church said they do. Martin Luther was like, nope, according to the Bible, all you need to get into heaven and be saved is your own personal faith. And so this also led to another important sort of foundation of Protestantism, which is that the Bible is the only authority in religious affairs. That the Bible is the only authority in religious affairs, not the church. Therefore, according to this logic, everyone should be able to read the Bible and make their own judgment, right? Everyone should be able to read the Bible and make their own judgment and be their own teacher. This, of course, is different from the attitude of the Catholic Church, which preferred to control the reading and interpretation of the Bible, which, of course, reinforced the Church's authority as an institution. And if one looks at the Bible as the sole authority in religious affairs, it also leads to a lot of skepticism or even dismissal of much of the external church doctrine, because things like the papal hierarchy, most of the sacraments, saints, indulgences, a lot of these practices that the Catholic Church had created were never actually in the Bible to begin with, right? And so for many Protestants, if it's not in the Bible, it's not part of their church, it's not part of their faith. So Martin Luther had developed these ideas, but he hadn't really shared them with anyone yet, because he also recognized, of course, that these were controversial ideas that some might consider, actually many would consider, to be heresy. So for now, he had mostly kept them to himself, until we get to the indulgence controversy of 1517. So in 1517, Pope Leo X, the fat gay Medici Pope, had authorized a special sale on indulgences because he needed money to pay for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. He also needed to pay off some church debts. And also, this special sale on indulgences, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire, covered the expenses of one of the local archbishops who had recently bought his position, that practice known as simony, and he needed to be reimbursed. So that meant that many members of the clergy, priests, monks, and many others were sent throughout the Holy Roman Empire and throughout Europe to sell indulgences to raise money for the church. So this Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel arrived in Luther's town of Wittenberg in October of 1517, selling indulgences. I want you to think of Johann Tetzel sort of like a used, sleazy cars salesman, just doing anything and everything to get a sale and telling anyone whatever they would want to hear in order to convince them to buy an indulgence. There's even this little jingle that is attributed to Tetzel. It says, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." And so here's Johann Tetzel taking advantage of many, many people who were eager to buy indulgences to save their own souls or save the souls of their relatives who might be burning in purgatory. And Martin Luther was watching all this, and he was extremely troubled by the ignorance of these people who believed in the power of indulgences. And he was also outraged at the Catholic Church for how they took advantage of these people. And so that frustration and that outrage is what led Luther to write and post the 95 Theses. And this may not seem like a monumental moment, but it is. This is one of the most important moments in European history. On October 31st of 1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg. Now, this actually was a common practice for people to post notices and maybe essays to a public place to perhaps invite a debate. And actually, that was Luther's intention. Is he only intended this to initiate a scholarly debate, not necessarily incite a full-on theological revolution. So the 95 Theses were essentially 95 complaints about the Catholic Church. 95 complaints about the Catholic Church. That's what you can think of it as. There's probably many more than 95, but as people read the 95 Theses, they were like, oh, wow, I feel that same way too. I share those same frustrations, those same grievances. And so his ideas actually became very popular, and a lot of people began to talk about them. It turns out that his criticism of the church and their numerous abuses, such as the sale of indulgences, really hit a nerve in Europe, right? Because there was so much of that culture of anti-clericalism. And within even a few months, within the next year, thousands of copies of the 95 Theses would be printed in German, and they made their way across the Holy Roman Empire. And this is what became the catalyst, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. So here is a little map I just wanted to show you geographically the area we are referring to. So this is modern day Germany. This is not the traditional map of the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century. But you can see that this red area, that's the sort of main area where a lot of this takes place. And the town of Wittenberg right there, that is where Luther posted his theses. The reaction to Luther was big. It was a big deal, basically. Obviously, Luther's ideas are going to be condemned by the church. As soon as the papacy learned about these ideas, they would condemn Luther and demand that he recant, meaning he takes back what he said and says it's all false, or he be excommunicated. And excommunication means that someone is kicked out of the church forever, which means they have no chance at salvation. The church also wanted Luther kicked out of his religious order as an Augustinian friar. However, one of the most powerful princes in Germany, Frederick III of Saxony, who also was an elector of the Holy Roman Emperor, offered protection to Luther. And this is key, right? Because Luther was able to make powerful friends in powerful places. This is what ultimately protected him from the wrath of the Catholic Church. Now, there was some question about why the Pope, Leo X, did not immediately summon Luther to Rome, for interrogation, investigation, and probably many other terrible things. But Leo X actually needed to remain on good terms with Frederick of Saxony. Frederick of Saxony, this powerful prince who was not only an elector of the Holy Roman Emperor, but there was even a chance that this Frederick of Saxony could become the next Holy Roman Emperor. So the best Leo X could do was to excommunicate Luther, but he did not summon him to Rome. And many of the contemporary critics and also later historians believe that this was really Leo X's big mistake. By not summoning Luther to Rome, he really was able to let the Protestant Reformation succeed. Not that that was Leo X's intention at all. Now, one of the important moments in the early Reformation is something known as the Leipzig debate of 1519. And this was a public debate between Martin Luther and Johann Eck, a Catholic theologian, about Catholic doctrine. So basically, this was a public debate where Luther was able to explain and defend many of his ideas that would become the foundation of Protestantism, like sola fide, and the Bible is the sole religious authority. Now, in this debate, Johann Eck was actually able to push Luther to publicly deny papal authority. And the reason that's a big deal is because denying papal authority is technically heresy. So he was able to get Luther to publicly admit to and demonstrate heresy. However, this event did not intimidate Luther. It only galvanized, it only encouraged Luther and his supporters to further challenge the Catholic Church. And after this debate, Luther would publish many more pamphlets and writings against the Catholic Church that would further develop his theological foundation of Protestantism. One of his most famous pamphlets, you can think of it sort of as like an essay, was called The Freedom of a Christian, where he lays out much of the theological foundation of Protestantism. Now, as I mentioned, Luther's ideas were incredibly popular, and most of the German states began to rally behind Luther, but for various reasons. For example, German princes who controlled many of these small territories, these principalities and little city-states, these German princes were eager to be rid of papal authority and eager to separate and distance themselves from the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. So they saw the Protestant Reformation as a political opportunity to gain sovereignty and independence from the church. Also, many of Luther's first followers were Christian humanists who were educated. They were often middle-class townspeople that had a university education. This also might include merchants and artisans, but this tended to be most popular with the educated middle class and with some members of the ruling class. And one of the reasons there was such quick popularity was because of that widespread anti-clericalism. We also might even say anti-Romanism, this sort of this criticism and disdain for Rome and the power that the Catholic Church had from Rome. This is also why Lutheranism, which is really the first form of Protestantism, Lutheranism, would be associated with states' rights. So Lutheranism is frequently associated with states' rights and political opportunity, as political leaders within the Holy Roman Empire saw Lutheranism as an opportunity to rebel against not only the church, but also the Holy Roman Emperor, who at that time was the young Charles V. And eventually, choosing the religion of one's territory became an issue of liberty, right? This is one of the things that will result from the Protestant Reformation, is that choosing the religion of your territory became an issue of liberty, And this will lead to lots of conflict. This is going to be the main contributing factors to the numerous religious wars that we will learn about later. Now, as I mentioned, one of the things that the Pope did in reaction to Luther was to excommunicate him. This took place in June of 1520, where Luther was formally excommunicated by Leo X and charged with 41 different heresies. And keep in mind, heresy was a crime punishable by death. So Luther actually was able to have a hearing of his excommunication. Think of this as sort of like almost like a court, right? Like a trial. And this hearing was held in the city of Worms. This event is known as the Diet of Worms. A diet at the time was considered an imperial assembly, right? So think of it as like a group of powerful guys in the Holy Roman Empire, not a diet of worms like someone is eating worms. So this was an assembly of powerful men in the empire that took place in the city of Worms, and it was overseen by the brand new Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was only about 18 years old at the time. Now, at the Diet of Worms, Luther is asked to recant, right? And if he recants, meaning he takes back everything he says and he apologizes and he does penance, then maybe he will be allowed to stay in the church and not be excommunicated or even executed. However, Luther stuck to his principles and he refused to recant. He refused to take back anything he said, which of course led to his excommunication, and what he was formally named an outlaw and a heretic in the Holy Roman Empire. He was fortunately able to escape execution with the help of some of his friends who were followers of Frederick III of Saxony. So remember, Frederick III of Saxony is sort of like Luther's protector, and so he was able to arrange for Luther to get out of Worms and avoid execution. Now, following this trial, Charles V would issue something called the Edict of Worms. An edict is like a declaration, the Edict of Worms. And the Edict of Worms was basically a law that forbid any changes to religion within the Holy Roman Empire. However, this edict, as a result, made religious reform an issue of the state. So again, this is how the Reformation becomes a very big political issue in the 16th century. Now, Luther would spend the next several years hiding out in Saxony under the protection of Frederick III. He would continue to write essays and pamphlets to develop his ideas, and he would continue to gain followers. And also, one of his greatest accomplishments was translating the Bible into German, because, of course, he believed that everyone should be able to read and access the Bible, and that became a key feature of Lutheranism and other forms of Protestantism. So let's take a look again at some of the key theological foundations of Luther's Protestantism. And this is a very important slide to understand because you will be asked to explain the differences between Protestantism and Catholicism. So again, the idea that really inspired Luther and became one of the founding characteristics of Protestantism is this concept of salvation by faith alone. Luther, using the Bible, had come to the conclusion that only true faith will justify a person's salvation, whereas the Catholic interpretation was that salvation came from faith and good works. And the Catholic Church defined good works as that mechanical path of salvation by participating in charity, by performing the sacraments, by giving money to the church, and by doing all the things that the church tells you to do. Whereas again, Luther said that only your inner faith was needed to justify a salvation. Another key component of Luther's ideas is that the Bible was the sole religious authority. So Luther believed that every Christian should be able to read and interpret the Bible on their own. and that the Bible is the only source of truth and authority on religious matters. He believed that followers should study true gospel teachings in the Bible and be able to distinguish those teachings from invented church doctrine, because many of the things that the Catholic Church had created were actually invented. They were not part of the Bible. Now, on the other hand, the Catholic interpretation here is that the clergy should read and interpret the Bible to the people. This was one of the reasons the Bible was mostly printed in Latin, and there were very few vernacular versions of the Bible. And the Catholic Church also believed that the Bible and the church were the religious authority. All right, so again, Protestantism says the Bible is the sole religious authority. The Catholic interpretation is that it's the Bible and the church. Now, this particular idea is significant because it directly challenges the papal hierarchy of the church and dismisses many aspects of invented church doctrine. This included things like monasticism, pilgrimages, the veneration of saints, clerical celibacy, and even papal authority. The last concept I want to talk about today is this idea of the priesthood of all believers. So Luther argued that each person should have an individual relationship with God, and that God is equally accessible to all of the faithful, and every Christian has equal potential to minister the Word of God. Whereas the Catholic interpretation is that the church and the clergy control access to God, and that only specially trained and appointed clergy has the ability to minister. So Luther has a much more egalitarian view where everyone should be able to have an individual relationship with God. God is equally accessible to everyone, and potentially anyone is able to minister. This is why centuries and centuries later, like in the 20th century, Protestants will eventually allow women to become ministers, whereas the Catholics still do not. And of course, the Catholic interpretation is that only the clergy can control that access to God. So those are the key ideas that become the foundation of Protestantism, and specifically Lutheranism, which is the form of Protestantism essentially developed by Martin Luther. In the next lecture, we will learn about how the Protestant Reformation spreads throughout Europe and the other interpretations of Protestantism that will develop following Luther's success in the early 16th century. But that brings us to the end of our lecture today. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for section 2.3, the spread of the Reformation.